The next session, reporting violence and oppression, which is something you've heard quite a lot about from Rachel already. We are waiting for our chair, Nick Cheeseman, who is in Kenya, and we're trying to reach him. But in the meantime, our other participants are waiting online. We owe Nick Cheeseman a great debt. He's a professor at Birmingham University, which has played a very big part in helping to get this conference off the ground. So I hope he reaches us soon. But in the meantime, I will chair the session with the participants. We have Mike and Monideepa online. That's Mike Owuor, who is editor of the Saturday Nation Media Group in Kenya. And Banerjie is executive editor, Eastern India, of NDTV, which is a leading channel in India. For 28 years, she's been with them. Can I invite Mike, first of all, to speak to us?
I'm glad to join you in this conference and to speak about reporting violence. Hopefully, we'll discuss how journalists in Kenya. I work for the National Media Group, the biggest media organization, one of the biggest in Africa, and I'm happy to discuss this this topic with you today. Thank you.
Right. Monideepa, would you like to introduce yourself and say a few words?
Good morning. Actually, it's well into the afternoon here in India. I'm in Kolkata, which is in the easternmost part of the country, and it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But it's a pleasure to join you here at Birmingham, and thank you for the privilege and the opportunity. And since we are all journalists here, and in the interest of accuracy, I'm a freelance journalist now. I moved on from NDTV, which is indeed the leading television channel in India. I moved on in January, and I'm looking out for new adventures. Happy to be with you in Birmingham.
Can I ask Mike to speak a little bit about the recent events in Kenya, which certainly he would have been involved in reporting political violence on more than one election in Kenya.
Thank you very much. Well, elections in Kenya are usually closely contested, and even though the voting goes on very peacefully, most of the trouble starts after the election. So there's what we'll describe as post-election violence. And in the history of Kenya, I think the worst was in 2007. I think that was covered globally. And that challenged the media because the media was accused of playing a part based on its reporting, the pre-election period, the campaign period, not censoring hate speech or fake news or propaganda, and taking sides. So the post-election violence, in which at least 1,000 people are killed, has defined how the media has been covering political violence since then. And the next election, which was in 2013, the media, and here I'm speaking about the traditional or the mainstream media, because the ecosystem is complex with the digital disruption and the rise of the social media across Africa, and particularly in Kenya. So in 2013, the media was accused of being too keen to ensure there was peace and not being bold enough and not being critical enough and not asking the hard questions on the electoral process and what the politicians were saying. And the same accusations came up in 2017, which was the second election after the violence in 2007. Now, in reporting violence, political violence, it's quite a complex issue. It may look simple because, I mean, you'll think you'll follow the editorial policy of your media organization or the code of conduct or broadcasting code. But when you get to the field, it becomes more complex than that. And it has become even more so with the rise of social media, where the citizen journalists can report whatever they want and can use all sorts of images that you cannot use as institutional media or as the traditional media. And so what happens in a lot of newsrooms in Kenya, especially particularly my newsroom, is interesting and sometimes contested guidelines. So for example, how do you describe the violence if there are people who claim to have a legitimate concern, who are protesting legitimately because they think the election was stolen or something was done that is well, against fairness, it's not unfair to them. Do you describe it as a riot? Do you describe it as, and the January 6th events in the US particularly shine a light on this. Do you describe it as an insurrection? Is it a riot? Is it unrest? Is it a violent protest? So how you define what is happening is very important in how it is perceived by your audiences. And it is also a delicate balance because your reporting could be used, or your reporting could incite further violence, while at the same time, if you do not report everything, you may be accused of trying to sweep things under the carpet or hiding things. So then it's important to exercise editorial judgment in each situation. And it depends on the standards for each newsroom and every country. I think I'll stop there and continue, take up the discussion later.
Yeah, no, some very valuable points there. Monideepa, can I ask you to look at things from your area? I know there's been quite a lot of very, what's the word? Not quite violent, but certainly high politics in West Bengal recently.
That's right. I heard Mike talking about political violence in Kenya, and sadly, I live in a state that has seen a lot of political violence, especially related to elections, and not just here in West Bengal, but also in the rest of my area of coverage specifically, and that is northeastern India, where we have seen numerous insurgencies, armed insurgencies, groups demanding they carve out their own country or carve out a separate state. So a lot of that has really roiled the Northeast for a long, long time. Things are, truth be told, a little better. The only incident of terrible violence that I recall in recent times was late last year in December, I think, when you had a military operation in a state called Nagaland, in which the armed forces ended up acting on obviously faulty intelligence and shot dead about 10 civilians in an encounter. It was one of the most horrific things that had happened in a part of the country in which we have something called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. And it's an act that enables military forces to take action with pretty much impunity. So Nagaland was a terrible situation late last year. Since then, the good news is the government has partially rolled back this act in many of these states affected by insurgencies. So that has brought some relief, and the move, though very limited, it has been rolled back in 3 states. One is Nagaland, one is Manipur, and the other one is the large state of Assam. So the Armed Forces Special Powers Act has been partially rolled back, removed from some districts, maybe some towns, because insurgency is on the dip over there, but not all of it. The draconian law is still in force in many parts of the Northeast and, of course, in Kashmir, and leads to violations of human rights, which rights activists certainly bring up and journalists report on. And it is a very sort of not the happiest kind of reporting one can do. A lot of that has happened, and I have done a lot of that from the Northeast. And in Bengal, it is primarily a lot of political violence when elections especially are held, when an attempt to rig begins from way before the actual casting of the vote. I mean, the rigging begins, and this has happened in the state for, I'd say, at least 40 years now. Rigging begins from the way electoral rolls are made. So, if you don't support a particular party, you might go to cast your vote and find that your name is not there on the electoral list, and you can't cast your vote. So that's also, what can I call it? Soft rigging, if you want to call it that, but there's a lot of that. And then there is the overt violence over winning elections, political parties clash. Bengal, sadly, has a poor record in this matter. People get killed on election day. And over the last few elections in Bengal, we have had elections held in multiple phases, like, over 7 days with gaps in between. And of course, the deployment of armed, not the military forces, but paramilitary forces who, sort of are posted at booths, who ride around in the voting area in mobile vans to ensure that there is no disturbance. It's been an uphill task here in Bengal to keep things quiet on election days. Not so bad in the rest of the country. For some strange reason, Bengal has this rather unenviable history.
Can I ask whether the rolling back or partial rolling back of this Military Forces Act was due to press coverage or media coverage of things like that event in Nagaland?
If you ask my personal opinion, I don't think so. I think they just rolled back because insurgencies are down. Nagaland is still an unsettled issue where, the Nagaland, the people of Nagaland, or at least the militant group in Nagaland, that is no longer militant, but in talks with the government, that group still wants certain things, like apparently they want their own flag. They want a passport of their own, and they want a larger Nagaland, which means, they want to sort of eat into territories of neighboring states and, become a bigger state. So these issues are still alive and well, but there is definitely a dip in violence, which is why the act has been rolled back. I must add at this point that the act has not been rolled back from the most contentious places where it is deployed, and that is Kashmir.
Yes. Please indicate if you'd like to ask a question, but I will ask Mike to also reflect on this point, whether the media has the power to prevent vote rigging and interference with the count in Kenya.
It's a difficult question to give a yes or no answer to, because I think political processes and political violence do not start from the voting or the counting of votes. So it's a process. So I think consistent and bold coverage throughout the electioneering period, checking that your democracy remains strong, is important even before voting day to ensure the systems are credible and there's confidence by all political players and the voters. I think that's more important to me because a lot of attention seems to be given on the voting and the post-election period. But many things happen before that. So, I mean, the mainstream media and now a lot of, Kenya has quite a robust social media landscape. A lot of citizen journalists are asking all the hard questions. I mean, people have the tools now to use their smartphones in wherever they are and to check their local electoral officials and the local campaigns. So it will be hard. I think the media has the power in the sense that if it shines a light and asks the hard questions before elections day, and I think elections have become more transparent in Kenya since that really terrible moment 15 years ago, and it's a lot more easier for journalists to get the election results, and. Well, sometimes, like in the last elections, the technology failed and there were all sorts of issues, but these were largely resolved at the Supreme Court. Although there were protests and there was violence after that, it wasn't as bad as previously when the system was opaque. So I would say the most important thing is to have consistent and bold coverage throughout the elections period and be vigilant throughout.
If I may ask, are we waiting for Nick?
We are.
Okay, sure. I mean, otherwise, if you like, I could, go ahead with my little presentation so that when Nick does come along, we don't run out of time.
Yes, please do.
We all have such a packed program today. Would you like me to do that?
Yes,
I think that might be a good idea. Yeah, lovely. So let me tell you that, on Sunday, this last Sunday, on the 26th of June, my notes for today's conference were ready. My thoughts were all sorted out for today's sessions. But development in my country, India, between Sunday and now, forced me into a breathless, last-minute, must-meet the deadline scurry to come and speak here. All of Monday and Tuesday saw such dramatic events in different parts of India, I really had to juggle everything I had planned to say. Juggle them up, juggle them down, juggle them sideways. But one thing didn't change, and that is the basic point that we are here to discuss today about journalists in India and many other parts of the world who are increasingly forced to counter violence and oppression on the job while reporting on those very issues in their respective countries, oppression and violence. Now, students here, and I can see some of the front benchers, but not all of them, students who are champing at the bit to join the media, don't say we didn't warn you, but welcome aboard, because in the times that we are in India and elsewhere, we need more and more committed journalists to uphold facts and truth and stop democracy from decay. Now, let me tell you what's been happening in India the last few days. On Tuesday, and not all of it is pleasant, on Tuesday, 2 Muslim youth, and I have to state their religion here, as their crime was triggered by sectarian hate. These 2 Muslim youth walked into the shop of a tailor in the state of Rajasthan. Some of you may have visited that top tourist destination. So they walked in there, pretended to be customers, asked to be measured up for shirts or whatever, and then out of the blue, attacked the tailor with huge cleavers and stabbed him to death. The tailor was a Hindu, and that was the conflict. There is more. While one youth attacked the tailor, the other filmed the murder and subsequently put the footage out into social media unedited. It was barbaric and chilling, and the footage went viral. Also viral, another bit of footage where the two killers, smiling, sit and explain why they killed the tailor. They say they killed him because he had posted online his support for one lady called Nupur Sharma, who happens to be a spokesperson of India's ruling party, the BJP, and who allegedly accused and, I beg your pardon, allegedly insulted the Prophet of Islam in a television debate. Now, ever since this happened, ever since she went and said rather questionable stuff on a national TV debate, a fact checker and journalist called Muhammad Zubair, he went online to highlight what she had done. And his campaign, as it were, really raised demands for action against this lady. Muhammad Zubair is a journalist and fact checker with Alt News, which is India's first major fact-checking outfit. Now, after Muhammad Zubair raised the issue and people were talking about it everywhere, no action was taken. And then finally, countries in the Middle East, they spoke up and expressed outrage to the Indian government about Nupur Sharma's comments. And they demanded an apology from the Indian government. After that, Nupur Sharma was subsequently suspended from the party, and the BJP, mind you, the party, the BJP, and not the Indian government, issued a statement dismissing her as a fringe element. It was one of India's worst diplomatic embarrassments in a long time. Now, all this happened weeks ago. This whole episode sort of ended mid-June, but actually it didn't. This Monday, the police in New Delhi, and yes, it does get a bit convoluted, but it's unbelievable sometimes. This Monday in New Delhi, the police arrested the fact-checking journalist, Muhammad Zubair. They accused him of hurting Hindu sentiments with a tweet he had posted 4 years ago in 2018. His post had a photo from a 1983 Hindi rom-com, the Bollywood rom-coms that are so popular here. So in that picture, it showed a hotel which was supposed to be called Hanuman Hotel, but somebody had renamed it Hanuman Hotel. Hanuman, of course, is the monkey god, much beloved in India. So when this happened, it was a shocking situation when, after that, immediately after that, on Monday, Zubair gets arrested. And on Tuesday, these two youth go and murder the tailor. And many on social media, and it went viral, blamed Muhammad Zubair for provoking those two Muslim men to brutally murder the tailor. Now, the suspended BJP spokesperson, Nupur Sharma, is free and at home, but Muhammad Zubair, he is in police custody till the 2nd of July. And fellow journalists are really sitting up and wondering what next and who next. So this, situation in the Indian media is really making things very turbulent. Now, Rome wasn't built in a day, and the challenges before the Indian media did not crop up in the last 1 week. It has been a work in progress for many years. The emergency of 1975 by the Congress government led by Mrs. Indira Gandhi was a body blow to the media then, when journalists who questioned the authorities were arrested by the dozen. But I don't have data on how India ranked on World Freedom Index back then. But if you take a look at some of the sliding rankings in the last 10 years, there is a story there. In 2012, India ranked 131 on the World Freedom Index. In 2022, it has slipped to 150, just a little better than Russia and several other countries. Even in terms of deaths of journalists, India ranked second only to Mexico, with 5 deaths of journalists last year. Mexico had 9. Last year, India arrested 7 journalists, much below China's 50, but then India is an electoral democracy, a vigorous, thriving democracy, mind you, with a media that is only growing, whether it's print or television or the digital space. You know, it's a growing industry, but it's definitely under pressure. Now, a huge, reason for the media coming under pressure quite easily is the revenue model. It is the advertisement. And newspapers pay our salaries, or television stations pay our salaries because they earn money from ads. A huge proportion of the ad revenue comes from government. And if you say something that displeases the government, then there is every chance that the tap will be turned off. And that determines editorial lines so much that a section of India's media has come to be called Godi media or lapdog media. Godi media is now part of mainstream conversations. Legally too, and that's the rub, legally too, the media is facing challenges. Last year, the government drew up something called Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Media Ethics Code Rules 2021. This under what we have had since the year 2000, the Information Technology Act. That sort of takes care of all that's happening in the digital space. Now, these new rules make intermediaries liable for content. And who are the intermediaries? They could be service providers, telecom service providers, search engines, web hosting service providers, and even the cyber cafe down the road where you go and sort of check out your mail if you don't have a computer or internet connection at home. So what's going to happen under these new rules is that if I go to a cafe, internet cafe, and write something and post it online, then not only am I liable, even the cyber cafe becomes liable. And it's something that media is very worried will be misused to attack press freedom in this country. The matter is in court. These rules also arrived at a time when the Pegasus scandal exploded in India. And it was discovered that some 49 journalists, some ministers of the government, opposition leaders, their numbers were apparently, used to insert the malicious spyware Pegasus. The matter is also in court. This happened in July last year. The Supreme Court set up a committee to investigate, and that investigation is still on. 1 year on, we don't know whether indeed the government deployed the malware or it didn't. So, that was a huge setback for the way Indian media looks at freedoms, which we have taken so much for granted. Nothing that you say on Indian media and the challenges before it can pass without reference to Kashmir. In January this year, the Kashmir Press Club shut down. Apparently, there were differences between sections of journalists, but those who claim to be in the know tell us that no such thing. It was just a bid, and a successful one at that, by authorities to stamp out the one free space for journalists that was still there in Kashmir. Kashmir, which also saw very long internet shutdowns between 2019 and 2021. Some put the figure at 550 hours of internet shutdown. Just not Kashmir, but practices across the country by both the government at New Delhi and regional governments. They use it so frequently that India is apparently the internet shutdown capital of the world. There were 3 shutdowns in 2012 and 109 in 2020. That's the latest figure that I could get. In Rajasthan, for instance, where there was that gruesome killing the other day, internet is off, possibly for a month. And since we are back to Rajasthan, let me go back to what I started with, and that is the issue of Rajasthan, Nupur Sharma, Mohammad Zubair. There is another alert that has emerged after the whole episode, and that is police in New Delhi, after arresting Mohammad Zubair, said that, that little line you put in your Twitter handle bio, that RTs are not, retweets are not endorsements, that is not going to work anymore, apparently. You are going to be responsible for whatever content you retweet or like. What the legality of this is, I still don't know. I mean, people have asked, say they don't know yet, lawyers or experts in the subject. I'd love to know what the rules are and laws are in your countries, in the UK, in Kenya, and elsewhere. Now, I know I've ended up painting a very dark picture of the way media is, going down a bit of a slippery slope in India, but all is not lost. A lot of hopes are resting on the courts. And in fact, recently, Supreme Court put in abeyance a sedition law, which was deployed against journalists and right activists to put them in jail. Apparently, the government of India wants to review the law. So the Supreme Court said, okay, you take your time, review it, but till it is reviewed, you cannot use that sedition law anymore to file new cases. So at least that's come as huge relief for many. This was a law that apparently the British had enacted here in India more than 100 years ago. Besides the courts, there is also the media itself, extremely robust, writing, protesting, and risking plenty to speak truth to power. And finally, there's inspiration that's coming in from all over the place. The latest, by the way, is from Honolulu, where a young Indian journalist from India, and I must congratulate him for doing this, Meghnad Bose, he was at the conference and happened to meet Maria Ressa, the Nobel laureate. And he stopped her and asked her on camera that, what she thinks about all that is going on in India, the arrest of an activist recently called Teesta Seetalwad, and I wish I could have spoken about her here, but I'm sure I'm running out of time. So he asked her about Teesta, he asked her about Mohammad Zubair as well. And here is what Maria Ressa said. She said, it's death by 1,000 cuts. The law is being weaponized. You need to mobilize your community. Start with the journalists. So in short, it's back to square one. Journalists who are victims of oppression and violence, while reporting oppression and violence, it is in their hands that change lies. So welcome aboard, students out there at Birmingham, and thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Monideepa. We've heard from Professor Nick Cheeseman. Apparently he is very unwell and has lost his voice. So he's online, but I think I will have to continue to chair. I have a question online from Victor Ogini for Mike. It says, how do you maintain a balance in violence reporting without inciting violence or holding back on the truth? I think he wants you to elaborate on what you were saying earlier.
Well, there's no single rule. It depends on the situation, depends on the local situation. But I think it's important for individual journalists and media organizations to have guidelines. And the guidelines are broad guidelines. So mostly you'll find them in the style book or the code of conduct or editorial policies. So for example, in Kenya, we are not supposed to, particularly the mainstream media organizations, because as I said, it's more complex now with a lot of citizen journalists and a very robust, social media presence, especially on Twitter. So if, for example, there are clashes between two groups in Kenya, you are not ordinarily supposed to if you think the clashes are ethnic, We're not supposed to identify the two communities. But sometimes it's important, like Monideepa said, it's important to identify these people. So if they are Muslims and they attacked a Hindu for particular reasons, what was the motivation behind that? I mean, that would be a good guideline for you. So generally, I wouldn't give one single rule for all situations, but I'll say it's important to have those guidelines in advance. And I gave the example of the January 6th events. I mean, the media in the United States, and this just shows that post-election violence can happen anywhere in the world. It's not just in developing countries. So was it an insurrection? Was it a protest? Was it a riot? Was it unrest? I mean, a lot of media organizations struggled with that. So it's really up to editorial judgment. I would leave it there. Thank you.
Right. Actually, while Monideepa was speaking, I looked up the RSF Press Freedom Index for Kenya, and I see it's jumped. Kenya is now 69 on the list, and last year was 102. So the situation seems to be improving.
Indeed. Wow.
Is this, and also, I mean, while we're talking about violence against journalists, does that mean that the situation has improved if your position on the index has jumped so high?
I think, in general terms, Kenya is among the countries with the free and robust media landscape, and so there are always attempts by the government to pass regulations and rules to try and stifle this. But with the strong judiciary, we'll always fight back and go to court. So it's a continuous fight, a continuous battle. Sometimes we lose some battles. The industry loses some battles. Sometimes it wins most of them. And I just want to say that the media in Kenya, like anywhere else, is under pressure from the digital disruption and from the economic situations, because the major institutional media here have largely been depending on print for a long time, until probably 10 years ago when this disruption really started. And so in reporting things like violence that need a lot of more experienced journalists, need a lot of equipment, and checking the safety of journalists, what equipment they have, it's becoming increasingly difficult for media organizations. And then they are also the place of citizen journalists. I mean, there's a lot of fake news, and people look up to the mainstream or what you call traditional media to give them, accurate and fair reporting. And just for the student journalists in here, it's getting better online now in terms of the tools that you have. So I gave the example of the 2007 election violence. A lot of images from that time continue to be used by people who spread fake news and say, oh, this has happened just the other day. But you have tools like the reverse search tools that you can check and see this is not the actual image. This was from a few years back. So to answer your question, I would say it's a continuous fight, but I think things are improving for the media in Kenya.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned those digital tools, because we'll be hearing from Caroline Scott of Google later on about just those things. But can I just ask, Mike, personal safety of journalists in Kenya, how do you feel about that?
We haven't had too many incidents of arrests or attacks because before 2010, when a new constitution was passed, it was easier for the government to do that. But now with, like I said, a robust, judiciary, and there's self-regulation through the Media Council of Kenya. And there are other strong professional organizations like the Kenya Editors Guild that protect journalists. So in terms of the safety or protection of government from the authorities, I would say they have a little, it's really more difficult for them to do, whatever they like to do, which is to shut down media organization to arrest journalists. But in terms of safety when reporting, that's more complicated because you're facing, you could be facing a gang when you're reporting that, or a mob. And for a lot of times, there haven't been too many incidents of journalists attacked in such situations. I can't remember of any in recent years. Within the last year.
Can I ask both of you, we discussed this in an earlier session, that the confrontation between the West and Russia over Ukraine, we're told that it's seen very differently in countries like Kenya and India, that there is far less of a clear right and wrong issue that, between Russia and the West. Can I ask you about that, Monideepa?
Yes, of course. It's a huge issue here in India, but basically India has refused to, or has avoided joining the international community in, attacking or criticizing Russia for its invasion or military operation in Ukraine. And initially, when that happened, there was surprise in, Indian circles. I remember a friend of mine, he said that, why is this matter even open for debate? You have to side with the victim in such a situation. And the victim was clearly Ukraine. But the government seemed to think very, very differently. The government, what it focused on was its foreign policy interests. And so we have a situation where, India has been talking to Russia. The Prime Minister has apparently spoken to President Putin several times and suggested that the whole situation be resolved as quickly as possible with as little loss of life as possible. But India at the same time is importing Russian oil, cheap, I believe, and cheaper than before. And that's the way it is. What critics of the government are saying is that this is a policy of, what shall I call it in English? A policy of, it's a skewed policy, and that you are only serving short-term interests at a time when the whole world is condemning, or lots of countries in the world are condemning what Russia is doing. But India seems, or at least the government seems to believe that it is foreign policy interest first. And we had that little spat between our foreign minister and the foreign secretary of the United States, who he was not speaking about India's stand on Russia, but he was talking about human rights issues in Russia, Mr. Blinken, and he said that we are concerned about India's human rights positions, and our minister, Jaishankar, shot back and said, we are concerned about human rights issues in the US as well. So that bit of, crisscrossing is there, but otherwise, given the broader picture of things, we find India joining, the Quad meetings and in Japan, and, India seems very much part of the US effort to hem in China. But when it comes to Russia, India seems to have gone back to its non-aligned position of the 1970s, when we did not take a position, we preferred to remain equidistant from both sides. And I will tell you that, there are many like my friends who believe that we should stand with the victim, but there are also many who say India's interests first.
Thank you, very interesting. Mike, can I ask you about that?
Yes, indeed. I think the present issue now, right now, is the high cost of living, which is attributed to to the war in Ukraine, because I think Kenya, like most parts of Africa, imports a lot of grain from Ukraine and some from Russia. But to your original question, I think the overwhelming feeling is that it's an unjust and unfair war. But at the same time, you hear debates about Western exceptionalism, which is, the West does certain things and they don't take responsibility for it. And some feel that Russia is standing up to his interests. But that's not the overwhelming feeling here. The overwhelming feeling is that it's not a fair war, and it's affecting people across Africa and across Kenya. But that hasn't stopped the debate I'm talking about, and it goes back to the colonial history and what the injustices that have been done in Africa, and nobody has taken responsibility for it. And so some see Russia standing up for its interests. And let me just repeat, that's not the overwhelming feeling.
We have only a couple of minutes left. I just wonder if I could ask both of you, given that this is a conference for students, what do you tell young people in your country who want to get into journalism? Can I start with you, Monideepa?
Of course. I can only say again and again, fight the good fight. And we need more and more committed journalists who can stand up and speak truth to power. And I can't think of a more, better way to do it than becoming a journalist. It is, I see friends in this business in India are really, really battling to stay afloat. And I admire them, I salute them, and they are in the most, I'm here in Kolkata, urban. I've always worked with the English-speaking media and national media, and it's been a fairly smooth ride for me. But when I see my stringers, young men and women out in the villages trying to bring facts out, I can only say that this is the best profession. And at this point, I must mention a film that was made and sent for the Oscars from India. It was called Fighting with Fire. And it was a film about a news effort by a group of women from the Dalit community, which is one of the weakest communities in the country. So these Dalit women, they got together, learned the business of putting out news first in a newspaper, then digital, and they are out there fighting to bring out the truth. And there are these wonderful, examples that we have in India of these small efforts being made out in the bonduks, away from urban English-speaking media houses, and they're doing a fabulous job. And you see them, and you know that the fight for keeping democracy afloat in the country is in good hands. So I say to the students out there, come aboard.
Thank you, Monideepa. Mike, very briefly.
Yeah, I think I tell them it's an exciting time to be a journalist, and it's important for Kenya's democracy that they join the profession. But the most important thing is the platforms may change, the technology may change, but the basic principles remain the same: accuracy, fairness, balance, and playing your role to, hold people in power to account so that our democracy remains strong.
Thank you both, Mike and Monideepa.